These kids are all grown up. I really want to kill my uncle all grown up with you. Yes, that was a Rugrats all grown up reference for you. Hello, interwebs. I'm here to review the latest episode of The House of the Dragon, the 8th episode of Season 1. And I will say I loved this episode for the most part. There's one choice made in the very last scene of the episode that I have some thoughts about, but overall I really enjoyed this episode, and this was one that I desperately needed for this show. I have been very open about the fact that I have felt that some of the the way that the fighting and infighting of the families between Alicent and Rhaenyra has been portrayed, especially in the last 2 or 3 episodes, has lost a lot of the nuance of the relationship between those two characters, especially as we saw them as little kids being friends. And I thought that it just kind of got lost in some of the mix and the heightening of tensions and the need for these time jumps all the time. And so I really needed this episode to happen where we actually got to see that nuance come back. And we got to see this distance between Rhaenyra's side and Alicent's side, the greens and the blacks, start to see that it's not just like people just hating each other, but there is some bonds that they still remember between each other. And I really appreciate this episode just adding a little bit more of that depth to everything going on here. Still showing that there are tensions, and there are tensions growing, but it's not just clearly like everyone hates everyone just based on the fact that they're on a different side of the table. No pun intended there, in this conflict. And so I think that this worked really, really well, especially on the fact that this is taking a kind of minor thing that happened in the book. In fact, I don't even think the whole questioning of lineage of Corliss Velaryon was in the book, though some events that happen in this episode do appear in the book. But just sort of bring that out to create this moment where these sort of tensions can happen. And I think that some people may complain about the fact that it's sort of creating a false conflict to sort of hang the hat on this episode of, but this is sort of the stuff that I needed to develop to bring us into this conflict that I really hope has all these nuances to it. Now, we'll get to more on my thoughts specifically as we go through the episode. It's clear that the show is definitely wanting us to side more with Rhaenyra than Alicent, and we'll get to that. And I think that that's an interesting take. I still don't really love this idea that the showrunners themselves have put out that Alicent's supposed to represent a woman for Trump type of character, which seems to, at least in the eyes of the writers, to really put her as the villain. And obviously I'm a leftist, so I'm no love for women for Trump by any means, but I think that there's more depth to her character that I see in this episode that has been missing, but they're still painting her as the villain, and we'll talk about that. And clearly we're supposed to side with Rhaenyra. One other thing to mention here, before I get into some specifics of the scenes, was we got another time jump, which means we got to see the kids grow up again. Most of the other actors all stayed the same, but this was mostly to get the kid actors aged up. And I liked most of them for the most part, except for the actors who played Aegon and Aemon. I found were interesting, not because they were bad. They're definitely decent and good actors. They definitely captured the spirit of those characters as I know them in the book and how I think they're going to develop. But Aegon does not look at all like the actor that played him last episode or so. And Aemon looks like he was just missed the sorting hat for Slytherin house. And they're he's the gonest motherfucker I've ever seen in my life, straight up Slytherin looking. So they're not going with a good, possibly a good guy look for that guy at all. And that's no shame on the actor. Clearly the makeup, the way that they heighten certain features is meant to heighten that look for him. So I'm not shaming the actor's looks at all. It's just sort of a very clear, they're going a certain direction with that character, which is fitting, but it was just an interesting sort of choice. Let's go into some of the actual specifics and discussions here. So we have this conflict of Lord Corliss has gotten possibly injured, sick, and dying. He may pass on. So his brother actually wants to claim the throne because he believes, correctly, that Rhaenyra's kids are bastards of Lord Strong, who died 2 episodes ago, and not actually true Velaryons. And so this causes everyone to come to King's Landing to get to see how they can sort of battle this out. And if this claim gets legitimacy, it might actually call into question Rhaenyra's throne as well, through lineages and all that sort of fun stuff that I'm not going to go over here because it's complicated politicking stuff, but it's all interesting and you can clearly see how it works. And I loved just seeing some of these small moments that we got here, like Rhaenyra worrying about this thing on Dragonstone with Daemon. Daemon's like, look, he doesn't really care about the throne. You don't need to always like make it just, it will affect that stuff, but it's not like his motivations are important here towards this, and sort of not alleviating some of her worries, but sort of directing her impulses. And seeing that despite the incest of their marriage, they do have a sort of interesting and loving relationship, which is an interesting just place for Daemon as a character. Like everyone loves to hate Daemon, right? And I have much more problematic views of him than I think others, considering like murdered his wife, and he's not particularly a great guy, but it is, you do feel for him at times. So I do love Matt Smith's portrayal of him. But then we get to King's Landing. Rhaenyra isn't greeted with anybody there to meet her, which we already saw a few episodes ago. I think in episode 4 was like a sign that like they're not giving her the respect she deserves. Alicent is now running the kingdom essentially with the Viserys sort of bedridden, and we get a quick scene with Rhaenyra and Alicent where they sort of like snidely sort of poke like politics at each other, and you get like small remembrances of like her cutting Rhaenyra's hand, which we see the scar, and you know Alicent sort of like going back and forth. And I liked that scene, especially in retrospect, looking back on the episode, because it again shows us like where they're at and how they just don't connect with each other. And I appreciated that scene because that seemed like a more subtle, nuanced version of like how they just don't see each other anymore, like in terms of like just as people, they just sort of see them as enemies, versus last episode where it got so heightened that I didn't really buy the height that her emotions got to with like her cutting Rhaenyra in that episode. I know some of you disagree. For me, I felt like it was going a little bit too far with her emotions in that moment. This is more what I kind of like to see, these sort of barbs at each other. Also, one other thing that I forgot to mention that I think points to how the show is trying to make us side more with Rhaenyra than with Alicent is the fact that in this episode we actually meet one of Daemon and Rhaenyra's kids, baby Aegon. And if that name sounds familiar to you, that is because it is the same name as Viserys and Alicent's kid, Aegon II. So now we have two Aegon IIs, one the elder from Viserys and Alicent, and one the younger from Rhaenyra and Daemon. Now, in the books, there's no spoilers for the books. I'm just going to state something that happens in the books versus the show. In the books, it was very clear that Rhaenyra naming her child Aegon was meant to be a kind of a snide moment towards Alicent, being like, oh, you named your kid after the Conqueror, I'm going to name my kid after the Conqueror, and I'm going to say that he has a better claim to the throne than you, because I'm Rhaenyra, my father named me heir, and so my son has a better claim than yours, and I'm going to sort of name him the same thing to just kind of have a pissing contest with you. And so that's kind of a petty thing for Rhaenyra to have done as a character, and it kind of paints her in a darker light in the book than in the show, because in the show, Aegon is just sort of briefly in the background for a moment. Now, maybe the show will have that sort of moment of like, you named your kid Aegon after my kid, just so you could like show me up moment, maybe in next episode or episodes from now. But the fact that they kind of yada-yada'd over it for a quick second, be like, yeah, the son's Aegon, and we also have a kid named Viserys, just like you, Dad, feels like the show taking a moment to like push off to the side that sort of moment for Rhaenyra as a character that might make her look a little bit more petty than they want her to look in this episode, versus Alicent, who they want to see in a little bit more of a villainous light. So it was just an interesting choice for the writers of this show version to sort of downplay that moment in order to showcase Rhaenyra in a more positive light. And again, I think that just highlights how this show is trying to highlight Rhaenyra as the more sympathetic character versus Alicent, who is supposed to be the more villainous character. It's just sort of an interesting writing choice. I personally like it better when they're not so seen as like clearly good or evil as characters, but I see the leanings of the writers in this, and that's their creative choice, so it's an interesting one. We also got a scene between Rhaenyra and Rhaenys, who Rhaenys doesn't really like Rhaenyra because she thinks that she killed her son and had her son killed, even though we know that that actually wasn't the case. And I like that sort of double speak there, where Rhaenyra said, like, look, I had no hand in killing your son, which we know she didn't because she didn't kill his son. So my issues with Laenor's storyline aside, some of the choices there, I do like how it's being presented moving forward in terms of its relationships to the other characters. And so I like that we're starting to see a relationship formed between these two women who would have been at odds with each other, but by political circumstance, they're actually on the same team here and kind of need each other. And I like Rhaenyra sort of playing that balance against each other, and there's sort of being a growing alliance there. This brings us then to this great sequence with Viserys and Rhaenyra. We have 2 scenes between the 2 of them where he's sort of on his bed, and the actor who plays Viserys, like, hot damn, like, they did a lot of great stuff with his makeup and his eye loss and all that stuff, which was interesting to see, and the great job, but, like, the actor's just playing how sick he is. I mean, this man's been on death's door for years now, but at this point, you're like, wow, it is rough to watch, and I love Matt Smith's Daemon sort of watching his brother, and you see how clearly you clearly see his affection for his brother and how sad he is to see him in this state. It's not just like him just like, oh, my brother's dying, I don't care. Like, you see how it affects him, but he's not like completely showing it. But it's more for Rhaenyra, who she's constantly placed in this place of like, look, you put this expectation on me, this burden on me. And I love that scene where they were like, she went to his bed while it was raining. It's like if you want this, like, defend me, but also like you get to see the conflict in her about how like she hates this. She hates this game that she has to play. And I love that. Again, it lets me be with Rhaenyra. And again, the show kind of making me side more with her than with Alicent, because we do have a scene with Alicent that I'll talk about in a second. But it making me empathize with her, being like, she's doing this because she believes that she has to, and the expectations that her father placed upon her, not just because of this prophecy, but because she wants to live up, she loves her father, yet she also wants to be this other person. And so this constant tension that she's placed into. And so I think the show is just making us really feel for her place in this world. Compare this to Alicent. I have conflicted feelings on this because while I will talk more positively about a scene later on, we have this sequence with Alicent where she sort of meets with this girl who her son Aegon sexually assaulted, and she basically gaslights this girl into staying quiet, and it's really manipulative and fucked up. And it's really, again, supposed to make me be against Alicent, being like, this girl's messed up and like terrible. Like, again, the show, but it's more nuanced though. That's, I think, what I want to get to. It's not like her being an out and out asshole. You know, like, she is being an out and out asshole here, but like she goes to her son and like calls him out, and you understand this like place that she's put into where she like has to protect her son, and yet she will do this horrible thing to this woman. And so I make like, the right thing to do would be, let's say, like, no, my son did this, fuck him, I know he did it, and I'm going to defend this girl, but you know that she's not going to do that because it's not politically expedient to her. So again, it vilifies her. And why are there so many cops outside my window tonight? It's annoying. So sorry if you're hearing the siren, but it makes you hate her. But it also just showcases the place that she's in, where she's just constantly putting her own family's ambition over like the actual right thing. And so I did really like seeing that conflict in her. That does lead into what we see later on in the episode, which is why I liked it more in retrospect, because it shows her conflict and how she kind of hates herself. And this all leads into, I'll skip over the middle sequence for a second where we had the claim stuff, because I kind of want to talk about that separately. But kind of naturally flowing into it, we get this dinner scene with Viserys where he is sort of like trying to pull them together, and you see how threadbare, like, he just loves them, and he wants them to stop fighting, and you just know that he has just failed as a king to just really bring any of these people together in any way, shape, or form. But he makes a last play, this empathy play of like, look, I'm dying, like, come together, and it works. Rhaenyra and Alicent actually like showcase caring for each other and actually like do like a like toast to each other, to the point where like Otto Hightower's like, you just said Rhaenyra would make a great queen, did you just like let that go? And I love that, because that plays off of the nuance that we saw with them as children, like this relationship and love for each other, sometimes queer-coded intentionally by the actors, of like they had like a kind of a romantic feelings for each other as kids. And this scene brought that back to the adult versions of these characters that I really needed to see, and I think it worked really nicely. And I think that builds off of the scenes that I had more issues with earlier with Alicent, because you see like she has problems with her own son Aegon II, who is going to be supposed to be king if her family gets her way, the Greens get their way, her father Otto Hightower gets his way, and she's like, he's kind of a little shit, so maybe Rhaenyra does deserve to be queen. And so I think that leads into this scene and adds to that, and I liked that, because again, it just brought up like Alicent kind of feels this way about maybe this would be the right choice to make. which then leads me to my hatred of the final scene of the episode, which we will get to. But going back a little bit, and we'll come back to that dinner scene, we get the sequence in the throne room where we sort of have this Valerian guy sort of questioning Rhaenyra's kids and sort of making his claim to the throne. We get Viserys coming in being like, I'm gonna like just make it up to the top of this throne. And I love the moment where Daemon brought him up to the throne. It actually like moved me. As much as I have conflicted feelings about Daemon as a character, love Matt Smith, that moment is just like, you really do see this, like, his caring, and it adds shades to Daemon's character that normally wouldn't be there. And I love Viserys, like, just like, no, I'm confused by this. Why are you doing this? Like, really standing by Rhaenyra here, as he is wont to do, and leading to this guy's death where Daemon just cuts off his head. And I love seeing here kid with the eye patch, Aemon, not Aegon, kid with the eye patch, sort of look at that death that Daemon caused and be like, that's kind of interesting. I'm into that. And you can be like, oh, you are a masochistic little asshole, aren't you? So he's kind of into it, and that guy gets killed. We also had a scene earlier where the Rhaenyra's two kids, Jason, the other, I'll just call him strong kid. Sorry, I know they take offense to that, but there you go. Sort of meeting Aemon and sort of the shame and tension between the two of them, which was also interesting to see. But then it brings us back to our dinner sequence where we get to see like the snide family jokes, but it all feels like what a family would be like, jokes at each other, sort of snide jokes like, oh, do you know where to put it, my cousin, sort of thing. Like Aegon the elder, he sucks, he's terrible, but you do see, at least it feels like a family moment here until Aemon, yes, eye patch kid, I keep getting the names confused because there's so many of them and they're so similar. He is that strong toast and really calls it out and ruins everything. And you get just ruins this whole night for everybody. And you see these tensions really will not die down because of all the trauma that's already been inflicted, like with his eye and everything. He lost his eye, and so it showcases that despite people trying to reconcile, there's always going to be some tension that's going to boil back up, that's going to reignite these things. And we get a nice little look between Daemon and Aemon, eye patch kid, Matt Smith and eye patch kid, that highlights that they have kind of a sort of begrudging sort of relationship there as uncle and nephew, and keep that in mind if you're not a book reader, I'll say. So that is all interesting, and so all of that I thought was really good, and I loved seeing these tensions rise back up again, even though they try to reconcile. Again, it added that nuance that I really needed. Also, we got the person's body being repaired, which is kind of gruesome, seeing his head cut off too. Though this does bring me to my frustration, which is the final scene of the episode, where Alicent goes to Viserys and he sort of says like, oh, the Song of Ice and Fire, like he regurgitates the Song of Ice and Fire thing and says Aegon, but he's talking about Aegon the Conqueror's vision of having to take the Iron Throne to stop the great the coming winter that we see in Game of Thrones. Like, he's thinking about that prophecy, he's thinking about that Aegon, not the Aegon that is his child. But then Alicent comes in and hears this and clearly mistakes it in his sort of, his sickness as like him affirming Aegon, his son, the Aegon II, the Elder's place on the throne. And I hate this. I hate this because it is so forced of a moment to reignite Alicent's belief that she is righteous in this. It gives her, it is there to motivate her as a character to be against Rhaenyra in a way that would, if she didn't have this, wouldn't make as much sense otherwise, because she just did have that moment where she did understand Rhaenyra. And I understand that for the story, the writers need to have Alicent be against Rhaenyra. That is the story that they are telling. But by doing this scene and having that probably going to be leading her to motivate her actions, being like, the king backed my claim. He said this. I feel righteous in that. It's gonna make it will make her look like an idiot / like petty, in like going forward with her motivations. And I think it really kind of does a denigration to her motivations going forward. I would have much rather there be nuance in it with her saying like, I think I just want to be in it for my family, or this is the right choice that I have to make. I think that's a much more nuanced choice and allows her to have tension against Rhaenyra because of her relationship to Rhaenyra and sort of like feeling that. Whereas now she sort of has this sense of righteousness that she has to do this thing because the king said so, instead of it being a much more conflicted one. You can still show conflict going forward from this, but I think it's just there to like give her character an extra like kick in the butt to get her to the place that I think the writers want her to be, to make her motivation make sense. If that makes sense. It's a very kind of subtle thing, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but I really dislike that final scene because I hate misunderstandings being used to motivate characters. It's one of my least favorite story tropes ever, where like a character said something and another character slightly misunderstands it, and if they had just said things the like slightly worded different way, everyone would have been fine. I just hate those types of misunderstanding scenes that motivate characters. It really just feels like frustrating, and it was just a bad note to end a really great episode on. Like this, if I took out that scene, I really love this episode, and it like sort of set some things right that I had been having issues with. Not fully, but a little bit. But then that scene happens, and I'm like, no, you were so close. It doesn't ruin the whole episode for me. I still like the episode on the whole, but that last little beat just put a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth. So that's my thoughts on this episode. Overall, I thought it was great, except for that one scene. But beyond that, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.